This is the exact problem that Liz Truss ran into, which is if you want to do tax cuts, especially if you want to do big structural tax cuts, you need to stop spending money. And a lot of these activists really struggle to identify cuts in spending on anything resembling the scale required. You know, I was at last conference with Liz Truss, and I was sat down with people going, how do we balance this? She said she's going to balance these numbers. Let's look at the government budgets and work out. We couldn't do it. You were taking half of it out of the education budget. The fact is, pensions are going to go up. Most Tory activists want pensions to keep going up. Housing costs are going to go up. Most Tory activists don't really want to be building houses. The NHS costs are going to go up. Most people want waiting lists brought down. The big pressures on public spending are going in one direction, and unless you have a policy solution for that, you do just have to keep paying for it, and that means that taxes will rise.
And I'm delighted to now be joined by Henry Hill. Henry Hill is Deputy Editor of Conservative Home, which is the go-to online destination place for all the information you need about the Conservative Party. It always has amazing kind of op-eds and lots of thinking and lots of polls and lots of interesting things going on. Henry, what is going on?
Oh, well, I mean, it seems to depend on where you look. Every minister seems to have a remarkable degree of licence to be doing their own thing. You were just talking about Michael Gove there, venturing his personal opinion on tax cuts. I was just chairing Conhome's first panel event, which was with Rachel Maclean, the housing minister, in which he said that actually, given the slogan of the conference is difficult decisions for the long term, the government does need to be looking again at full fat planning reform. Now, I don't know if that's something that has been signed off by Number 10, but nonetheless, that is what she said. So it's essentially, I think the dynamic is Rishi Sunak knows that this is his last conference, probably with a decent run-up before the election. It's his last chance to try and define his personal vision, to try and give the country and his own MPs and activists an understanding of who he is and why he wants to govern. But at the same time, the Conservatives are so far behind in the polls, I don't think anyone really thinks that's going to be turned around. And so there is inevitably, everyone has half their eye over his shoulder at the leadership election that will probably happen at some point next year.
And what's really interesting is his body language this morning on the Laura Kuenssberg show. I mean, he is obviously feeling that he wants to be quite punchy and look very confident. I felt like his body language was kind of slightly different. He was sort of Scrappy-Doo kind of out there, sort of, you know.
Absolutely, Scrappy-Doo is the mental image you want to conjure when you're a strong prime minister.
When you're a political colossus. But he clearly thinks that he's onto something with these changes on net zero. This kind of I'm sticking up for the motorists. I mean, his strategists clearly think they're onto something here.
I've no doubt that these policy announcements have been focus grouped to within an inch of their life. Many of them will be individually popular. And one of the things that Rishi does need to do is find a way to connect what can often be very abstract arguments about growth and inflation into policies with a direct, tangible impact on voters. And things like, I'm allowing you to keep your car, I'm stopping them doing that really irritating speed limit. That is the kind of thing that people can connect with. I think the problem that he has is that, so far at least, it doesn't add up to anything. Normally you can have all of these individual policies, but if they don't add up to a coherent vision, voters won't take them seriously. If you remember in 2015 when Labour was doing this, they were focus grouping all their policies, and it got derisively dismissed by their American advisor as vote Labour to win a microwave.
I remember it well, Henry. The retail offer.
Because there wasn't
Should have been an air fryer, to be honest. I think we would have had more luck with that.
Potentially, and I think that's the problem Rishi has. I've no doubt that many of these policies, if you ask voters individually, they'll be popular, but if they don't cohere and they don't believe the Prime Minister will deliver them, that's going to be a very limited use.
It's also worth reminding people that when you poll individual policies across the political spectrum, when you polled individual policies from Jeremy Corbyn's 2019 manifesto individually, they were incredibly popular. It's just that people didn't want to vote for them collectively.
Precisely. And also a poll about whether or not you support something doesn't tell you how personally important that issue is to you relative to other things, right? I could go and tell you, oh yeah, I do hate the 20 per hour speed limit, whatever, but actually I'm going to vote on schools or I'm going to vote on taxes. And so that can be a really misleading bit of information. And also it's worth remembering the public is not obliged to have a completely coherent policy position. If you add up all of the popular policies and unpopular policies of every national pollster, you get something that does not cohere and is not deliverable. So it's a problem for Rishi that he does seem to be being led in this way, reacting, grabbing little issues issue by issue, rather than actually setting a course.
Now, last night I had a really interesting debate on the sort of final hour of my show between sort of kind of two generations of Conservatives. Tim Montgomery, who was the founder of Conservative Home, quite a sort of grandee, and Ryan Shorthouse from Bright Blue, who kind of represents a sort of younger wing of the Conservative Party. And they were clashing over big issues like house building and tax cuts, and who you should be appealing to. And Tim Montgomery was saying, look, we're in such a bad position. All he has to care about is his absolute sort of red wall base, just through red meat to because we've got to cauterise the loss of political blood that's potentially coming down the track. And Ryan was saying, well, actually, that's not sensible, because you're going to lose younger voters, and they're not necessarily going to suddenly become Conservative as they get older because they don't even have a house or anything. How does Tory strategists strike that right balance?
They're really struggling. You hear an awful lot of talk about the long term, but the problem is that the long term never actually arrives, right? It's always easiest to do stuff for the short term and just airily say, oh, we're going to do something for the long term in the future. But now we need to focus on the short term. And this has been happening with the Conservatives a lot. And I think it's actually really interesting that people are conflating the base with the red wall, because, of course, the red wall is actually an incredibly fragile extension of the Conservative vote that Boris Johnson won in very particular circumstances in 2019. And I think one of the hardest decisions Rishi has to make for this election is, does he commit lots of resources to that, or does he try and dig in the so-called blue wall, traditional Conservative seats, which they are at risk of losing to the Liberal Democrats. And, as the 90s showed, if you lose a seat to the Lib Dems, until they're brave or foolish enough to go into government, it's lost for a generation.
And, one of the things that is obviously uniting a lot of backbenchers and activists is tax cuts. I mean, we spoke to an activist from the Ribble Valley yesterday, and she was saying, look, the one thing that would really give me some cheer is if Rishi Sunak abolishes inheritance tax. We know that there's this clamour for tax cuts. I mean, how realistic is any of that, Henry?
I mean, this is the exact problem that Liz Truss ran into, which is if you want to do tax cuts, especially if you want to do big structural tax cuts, you need to stop spending money. And a lot of these activists really struggle to identify cuts in spending on anything resembling the scale required. I was at last conference where with Liz Truss, and I was sat down with people going, how do we balance this? She said she's going to balance these numbers. Let's look at the government budgets and work out. We couldn't do it. You were taking half of it out of the education budget. The fact is, pensions are going to go up. Most Tory activists want pensions to keep going up. Housing costs are going to go up. Most Tory activists don't really want to be building houses. The NHS costs are going to go up. Most people want waiting lists brought down. The big pressures on public spending are going in one direction, and unless you have a policy solution for that, you do just have to keep paying for it, and that means that taxes will rise.
And it is extraordinary, isn't it? I think the sort of annoyance that a lot of people have, and the kind of frustration that a lot of Conservatives have, is that you're 13 years into a Tory government. You've got the highest taxes in living memory. You've arguably got the biggest state in living memory. You've got the highest immigration on record as well. And you've got business kind of doing their nut-in as well. I mean, that doesn't feel like a sort of like true blue conservatism to me.
No, it's almost as if we've had sort of 4 prime ministers in that 13 years and changed course several times. I think you could write an essay on this, but I think that the core of the problem is that David Cameron and George Osborne came in 2010. They had been busy triangulating against New Labour. They didn't actually have a vision for a smaller state, and therefore when they did austerity, they salami sliced all the budgets, which means that they made everything worse and they spent less money on nearly everything, but they kept the footprint of the state and public's expectations of what the state should do the same. But I think that was the foundational sin of this period of Conservative government, is that they cut lots of money, but they didn't reduce its government's responsibilities at all. Then obviously they shot themselves in the foot with the EU referendum, and we just got distracted from it for several years. But ultimately, the problem with this is traced back to austerity. The government took an awful lot of money out of the public sector, but it didn't change the shape of the public sector, and we're paying for that now because the government is as big as ever, but nothing works.
And we've just had an email in from Robert in Farnborough. Robert says tax cutters are insane. The IFS says taxes must go up to maintain the NHS. And by the way, do keep your comments coming in. You can text 87222, start your message with the word Times. You can email studio@times.radio, or you can tweet @timesradio, or you can tweet me directly at Aisha Hazarika. I mean, Henry, what's fascinating is that everybody accepts that our public services need more money, but we have no political leader right now saying we have to increase taxes.
Because taxes are already very high, and yes, they could go higher, but the problem is that the growth of a lot of this is unsustainable, right? Especially if currently the NHS rations access through waiting lists. We underspend on things like social care. If you actually ramped all of that spending up, not even realistic tax increases is going to cover it all, and it's going to engorge and take a larger and larger share of our economy. So I think that we do actually have to have very difficult conversations about the shape of this. Are there ways in which we can change the structure of the NHS so that it concentrates scarce resources on the most needy, and wealthier people actually do contribute towards the cost of their own care and so on? And we don't have any of that kind of leadership. So instead we're stuck in this impossible position where no one wants to change how any of these things work, which means that the costs are just going to keep going up. But realistically, the amount of tax that the public are actually prepared to pay we've maybe not maxed it out, but it's not infinite. So until we have that discussion, we are just going to keep having this problem.
And look, some people would say, to be fair to him, Boris Johnson did say, look, we are going to have to put national insurance up a bit to pay for the NHS and social care.
And I think the great iniquity, of course, with that is that national insurance is a tax paid by working age people, and they already face huge marginal tax rates. And I think that's actually the biggest problem the Conservative Party has, is that it's overwhelmingly backed by older voters. A lot of older voters, by no means all, but a lot of older voters are sitting on final salary pensions, very valuable property. None of that wealth is taxed. They're exempt from national insurance. And that means that there is a huge iniquity there. And unless the Conservatives are prepared to bite that bullet at some point, they are only going to keep alienating working age voters who are going to be paying more and more and more for a state that seems increasingly concentrated on the needs of the over 65s.